All right, hello and welcome to Regenerative Gardening, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Jackson County Master Gardeners. My name is Spencer. I'm an adult services librarian here at Jackson County Library Services in Medford. I want to remind everyone to keep your microphone muted to avoid distractions for our presenter during the presentation. We can use the chat function to ask questions. Some of them we may take during the presentation. Some of them we'll get to at the end. If we're doing them at the end, I will read them for our presenter, Rihanna, to share answers or feedback, that sort of thing. And other than that, we will just sit back and enjoy the presentation, hopefully. I want to share our land acknowledgement really quick, which is that the Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and the Modoc Nation, as well as the Shasta, Tacoma, and Lagawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. We take this moment to recognize the Indigenous people whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for Indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. Lastly, I do want to share that the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of JCLS. Don't know that that's going to come up today. I don't think there's anything too chaotic or controversial about gardening, but you never know. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rihanna and turn off my camera. If you have questions, we can facilitate those in the chat either now or at the end, depending on what they are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Spencer. And welcome, everyone. My name is Ryan Sims, and we are together here this afternoon on a Saturday to talk about regenerative gardening. And the focus really will be around cultivating life and joy in your garden. And so I'm going to share some tips that I have learned along the way and really hopefully leave you with some more inspiration to get out into your garden. This is a little bit more about me here. I'm the owner and lead farmer at Verdant Phoenix Farm, just outside Talent here in Southern Oregon. I have a master's degree in adult education and botany, and so teaching about gardening is really one of my life's passions. And so thank you for joining me this afternoon to share about something that I'm really, that brings me a lot of joy and that I find has really been part of my life's work. So we live on a 1-acre urban farm where I have a commercial greenhouse, and we sell certified organic vegetable starts and pollinator starts from our farm stand. We're on Culver Road, just outside Talent. And we also have a 10-acre certified organic farm just down the way from us, also just outside Talent. So part of what I've been working on and part of my passion is that we have some soil research that's been funded by the United States Department of Agriculture, focusing on soil health and how to manage soil in a way that actually builds soil health over time. We also have funded research with the Organic Farming Research Foundation. And so not only are we engaged in education, but we're really passionate about helping to really push organic gardening and organic farming and develop new strategies and techniques for farmers and gardeners alike. And we also have been selling European basketry willow. That's part of what we grow on our farm and sell our some of the old world varieties of willow that are used specifically for basketry. So let me just figure out my controls really quick. There we go. Okay, so I'd love to start us off with just setting a common vocabulary for this workshop and our time together, and to really start to look at the word regenerate. That why are we talking about regenerative gardening? So sustainable gardening, sustaining means to maintain what is already there. So you're sustaining what you already have. But regenerating actually alludes to this regrowing or replacing something that was lost or injured. And for many of us, when our homes were built or, in urban areas, the soil has been stressed and injured. And so the process of regenerative gardening is actually regenerating that life, bringing life back to these spaces. I also really like, and we'll kind of be weaving throughout this workshop, this also other definition, this adjective, or to be reformed or reborn in kind of a spiritual or moral sense. And I think that this has an important subtext to our conversation here, and to really looking at regenerative gardening as a call to action, and maybe at there being a spiritual component of that. As human beings, part of our health is connected with the earth, and so the more that we can get outside and get in our gardens, really the healthier we are as well. Whoop. So to regenerate, again, to bring something into renewed existence, to bring new and more vigorous life to something. Often this is used in economic terms, but I think, again, in biological terms, that we're bringing more life to the soil. We're bringing life to our gardens. And then also, again, this kind of spiritual context of giving a new or higher spiritual nature to someone or something. And so just wanting to connect that kind of greater sense of ourselves and that connectedness with the universe and with the earth back to our gardens. So in regenerative gardening, we take an ecological approach. So we're just setting the terms for where, how we're viewing these concepts, and to really kind of look more closely at these concepts. And then we'll talk about the application, how to live them, how to walk with them, what to do on a Sunday with this information. And this is an ecological approach to gardening. And so it's a little different than some people's approach. I love the ecology, really this branch of biology that deals with the relationships between organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. So when we're regenerating our gardens, when we're bringing more life back to our gardens, this is an ecological endeavor where we're highlighting the relationships of organisms to each other, and then also to themselves and to us. So taking that ecological approach is really relating to or having concern for those relationships, wanting those relationships with the microbes, with the worms, with the pollinators to be strong in our gardens, because then that ecology then supports the life that we're hoping to regenerate in our gardens and in our lives. So this is all in really stark contrast to an extraction style gardening, or in the past when many gardeners and farmers were looking at the soil and gardening as more of a chemistry, more of an issue of chemistry, where they were very focused on NPK, on those nutrients, but more of a chemical approach, where it saw your garden or your farm as like a blank canvas in which you lay chemistry upon. And regenerative gardening is actually very different. It actually is taking, again, this ecological approach that refers to this ability of the ecosystem and all its players to renew and recover from damage. This is really hopeful that we can renew and recover from what's been done in the past and bring forth this regenerative and new set of relationships. So part of our themes that we'll be talking about this afternoon is we'll be weaving this theme of regeneration throughout each of the topics that we'll cover. So we will start with the soil. We'll really look at how to protect the soil and to feed it, how to regenerate those soil-based relationships and the soil-based organisms. We'll again focus on ecology and really start to look at our gardens as habitat. This can also transfer to farms as well, but once we start looking at our garden as habitat, it can help us to know how to manage it or what to do next. I have a couple of tips based on my experience of gardening. I've been gardening really my whole life. I grew up on a farm in Texas, and also worked for the Oregon State University Extension Service for 10 years, where I ran the Master Gardener program. And so based in the land steward program. And so based on those, my work experience there, I've seen a lot of gardens. I've talked to a lot of gardeners. I've read a lot about gardening. It's really my passion. And so I've distilled some of that learning for you today in some of my kind of like top 5 tips for a successful garden. We'll talk about mulch because that's one of the most important and critical action steps that you can take in your garden to regenerate those relationships is to mulch. And we'll talk quite a bit about what is mulch and why and what types. And then we'll go through a little bit of a garden assessment. There's some tips around how to kind of assess your garden or maybe you have a client if you're a professional, or if you are just looking at, gosh, what can I do next in my garden? And this will be some tips to assess, maybe some next steps for kind of enhance productivity and to regenerate your own relationship with your garden. And that really the goal of this class is not only to share some interesting biology and science and show you how to apply that in your life, but really the goal of this class is to help you fall in love with your garden again, to make sure that you feel connected to your garden, that it's feeding you so that you then feel passionate to feed it. So that's where we're headed today. So to lay the foundation for our understanding of regenerative gardening and to focus on the soil, I want to acknowledge two of my really important teachers and my mentors. One is Dr. Elaine Ingham, who really coined the phrase and really helped to bring attention to the biology in the soil through her naming it the soil food web. Before Dr. Elaine Ingham had talked about the soil in this way, people didn't see these interconnected relationships. And so with Dr. Elaine Ingham and the soil food web, what she's showing there on the screen or in that diagram is all of the interconnectedness between those soil-based organisms, and that at each point when another organism is eating and then growing and pooping, and they're getting eaten and growing and pooping, that there is a net positive nitrogen. You're actually gaining soil nutrition every time there's another type of organism that's interacting in this soil food web. Dr. Elaine Ingham had a really powerful hypothesis and theory that she wrote about when she worked for Oregon State University, and that was that if you have healthy soil biology, if you have healthy soil creatures in your garden and in your farm, there is no need for fertilizer. That's powerful, right? This flies against the idea of that the soil is a blank canvas to add chemistry on. It actually says if you have healthy biology, there actually is no need for chemistry because the creatures are creating those nutrients through their interactions. My other mentor was Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote The One Straw Revolution. The man who edited and translated his book, Larry Korn, was actually here from Ashland, Oregon. And part of what Masanobu Fukuoka talked about is he actually started at an extension service and had very formal scientific training. But what he noticed is that many of the farmers weren't utilizing the relationships in an ecological way to support their gardening and their farming. And that Fukuoka started to talk about how can we do less in our gardens and on our farms and actually mimic the cycles of nature to grow soil health and add productivity to our gardens and our farms. So these were two really revolutionaries in gardening, and I strongly encourage you to check out their writing and their research. And it really has informed my style of gardening and my style of farming that I'm passionate about and will be sharing about today. The other important person who I want to acknowledge is Suzanne Simard, who wrote this Finding the Mother Tree. And part of what she talked about is in this ecological approach to gardening that she started to look at the exchange between individuals in the garden, in the forest, and on the farm, where she proved scientifically that these organisms and trees are involved in a constant exchange of resources and information. That she took this ecological approach to a whole new level and really is really challenging the idea that gardening and farming, that what's going on there is a competition-based model. And she's really turned that on its head and said, actually, in ecology, there's so much more sharing that happens. There's so much more coexistence and support for what they're calling companions to be able to thrive. And I love her quote that reciprocity is a basic mechanism of life. And so that's part of what we're reaching for in regenerative gardening, is saying we want, not only is the garden feeding us, but we feed the garden. And that reciprocity then fosters more life, both for us, but also the soil and also the ecosystem where we live. So if we were together in an in-person class, I'm notorious when I taught the Master Gardener program, I loved having people smell live soil. And we would always laugh about it doesn't smell gross. We'd always try it out on someone to say this is not a yucky smell. But actually, that when we smell healthy living soil, it taps into this deep part of us as human beings, that our life and our well-being are actually directly tied to the smell of healthy soil. And we know intuitively when soil is healthy. We can actually smell the actinomycetes. We can smell the microorganisms. And it's so important and deep in our neurosynapses, there are neural pathways that people can immediately identify when soil is alive and full of life and when soil is dormant or needs to be kind of regenerated. So some of the concepts that we'll talk about with soil today are really, the most important one is to protect your soil, to treat it as habitat, to treat it as an intricate ecosystem that should be protected and preserved. And so that means no stirring. It means no rototilling, no stirring. It means no mixing. It means that we want to, in order to protect the soil, we want to keep it covered. We want to make sure that it has a cozy layer of leaves this time of year, that it has mulch on it or is somehow covered, and that we're constantly feeding our soil, that every season we're providing something for the soil biology to eat, that it's not chemistry we're laying on the soil, it's actually food we're giving to nurture the life within the soil. We'll talk a little bit more about those examples or what that could be. So how do we do that? How do we protect the soil and feed it? We add organic matter. What is organic matter? Organic matter is anything that was once alive that is now dead. So grass clippings, coffee grounds, compost, moldy straw, anything like that from the natural world. Another way we can protect the soil and also feed it is through planting seeds. And this is an important strategy. If you have a distressed soil, you're like, God, my raised beds don't look good, or my garden's just not doing well. The soil looks parched or dry, or there's not much life in it. Even just starting to sprinkle some radish seeds or some easy growing seeds in there so that you get those roots in and you're sparking that, again, that regenerative opportunity that comes from the relationship between the soil microbes and the plant roots and the plants growing there. So when we start to treat the soil like it's a habitat for our favorite creatures, it changes our behavior and changes the way we look at it. Sometimes it can be easier to, kind of save the old growth forests or look at these big trees and these forests and see that as an ecosystem to be protected, which it is. But the same is actually true in our soil, just on a much smaller scale, where it actually is also an intricate ecosystem to be protected and valued and honored and fed. And that when we rototill it and we make that habitat all the same, there's nowhere for those creatures to live and create habitat. There's no food for them. And so part of what we want to do is to start with the soil. And often that's just participating by adding organic matter or planting seeds. So protecting the habitat in the soil. So what is soil? when we think about it, what is soil? And I love this slide because it really shows that, you see there the orange, 25% of soil is airspace. And in the gray, 25% is water. And 45% are the minerals that make up soil. So when we think about that, about 45% is that mineral element. So where the soil was born from, that bedrock. But then actually that those air pockets, the holes, all of those pores, micropores, macropores, means that water and air is held inside the soil in with those minerals. Why is that? What is it that living creatures need in order to thrive? They need air and water and food. And so in our soil, we want to make sure that they have air and water and food, and that food comes in the form of organic matter. In biomass, that is the living organisms themselves, those small creatures, the creepy crawlers, the no-see-ums. It's also in the debris. So that's where it's identifiable dead tissue. So dry leaves. You can see that that's a dry leaf on the soil and it's yet to break down. And then the humus is where there's no longer any tissue to point to, but it's actually the remnants of those nutrients and that those creatures that were once alive and are now dead. So this is a critical part because it really impacts how you're relating and what you're doing, what your management is of your soil. So when you think about an old dirt road or a old driveway that's not paved, but just that is dirt, think about where you park your car and then no plants start to grow there in that spot. Is it because those plants are being run over? That's not actually why. It's because that no plants are growing in those tire ruts because the soil has been compacted, and that means that there is no longer 25% air, no longer 25% water. And so it means that there isn't room or a healthy ecosystem for those roots to make their way. So often when we're protecting our soil, we actually are just trying not to harm it. We kind of joke about just don't mess it up. The soil is already regenerated, is already full of life, and will continue to be full of life. What we want to do is participate in a good way to show our values. But often the answer is just don't mess it up. So when we're looking at our soil, and check out these layers here, again, part of why we say no stirring, no rototilling, is because the soil has these layers, which in soil science are called horizons. So these different horizons of soil are very intentional and are formed because of the interaction with air, water, temperature, nutrients. And there are very specific creatures who live in each one of those layers. And so if we go along and we're like, well, we're just going to mix this all up, those creatures who are in the subsoil B and are brought to the top, they don't want to be in the top surface. They need to be where, in the horizon where they were. So it's important that we keep those layers intact when we're gardening or farming. That's part of why no-till farming is so important and no-till gardening is so important, is that it provides a way that we feed organic matter on the top, just as you can see that O horizon, that's for the organic matter there, where we're feeding on the top, and that's the area where there's the most microbial life, and they're just ready. They're sitting at the buffet ready to eat. So we are just putting food for them. They're in the right place at the right time to eat, and then they're making those nutrients available. Also, when we bring up those carbon, all of the carbon that was once in the soil, and we bring that to the surface, immediately when it comes into contact with oxygen, carbon and oxygen bind, and that's CO2 is released. So part of what we're understanding is the importance of keeping carbon in the soil, protecting carbon and making sure that carbon is not interacting with oxygen. And that, as I mentioned, that there are creatures that live in each layer and want to stay in each layer. And they will die if you bring them, many will die if you bring them up or mix them about, or will be killed by the machinery. So this is another reason that if you have been rototilling, or maybe you need to help your housemate or your husband or your wife to understand that actually the rototiller is killing so many of those microbes and creatures that are necessary to do the work in your garden, to break down materials and make nutrients available. So how can we feed our soil? What do we feed them? We add organic matter. And the more that you kind of geek out about soils and start to learn about it, you realize that the more diverse materials that you add to your soil, the more diversity in the organic matter you add, the more diversity in the nutrients that are available to your plants. So we want to add. That's why composting is so amazing and powerful. It's bringing all of these nutrients that are in the food that we eat, helping the microbes eat them, and then bringing that back to the soil. So you can see the straw there. Adding straw is a great way to add organic matter. Adding leaf litter or dried leaves or leaf mulch to your garden is another great way to protect your soil and to add organic matter to feed those critters who are doing the work of making nutrients available for your plants. So that organic matter, not only does it provide food for the microorganisms, so the microorganisms are the ones who are in the habitat that you're wanting to protect. It also provides a water source or an ability to hold water. Organic matter provides shelter or protection for those little creatures, and also the opportunity for air and pore space. So organic matter really is so critical. So if there's one thing that you can do in your garden to improve it or on your farm, it's to add organic matter every season. Every season, 4 times a year would be ideal. But even if it's 1 time a year, you're wanting to make sure that you keep adding this material. Right now, as it's frosting and cold, many folks are kind of cleaning up their garden. And I'm always so sad when I see people pulling organic matter out of their garden and putting it in a trash bag to be thrown away. When it's like helping to reframe that in a regenerative system, we're wanting all those nutrients that are in those plant bodies to go back into the soil. So like your tomatoes that have frosted, or maybe you have some lettuce that, was great and then is past, just go ahead and cut them at the soil surface. Leave those roots in the ground, but then keep that organic matter on the soil. The only time that you would not do that is if you've had a serious disease. And in most gardens and most farms, we don't really see diseases that are that impactful. And so going ahead and keeping that organic matter in the soil is just a really easy and important way to protect your soil and to feed those microbes that we're providing habitat for. So another look here at the soil food web. So again, when we're adding that organic matter, we're keeping the layers of the soil intact. That's because all these creatures live there. They're all living in that area. That is what they want to eat. So the shredders come in and they start to make those leaves small. Then the fungus and maybe bacteria come in and start to melt and open those cell walls. And then the worms and the other creatures can come in and eat. And then you can see how then the birds and the mammals come in and then eat. And so this really is an incredible ecosystem that we're fostering and protecting right under our feet, right in our gardens. And we can participate with such ease. This is also just dynamic in thinking about what types of organic matter you're laying down and what creatures you might want to support there. But this is what these are the creatures we're trying to protect by covering the soil and by adding organic matter. Another form of organic matter that is is called mulch, and that's usually a dry, more carbonous material. Things like pine bark, pine needles. This is kind of interesting. This is like a example from Australia. They have eucalyptus and the melaleuca, which is tea tree bark chips, but you could also use rock or compost. But this is mulch is a carbon-based material that again is laid on the soil surface to provide habitat to those creatures and to help retain soil moisture, to add that layer of protection. This is one of the best things that you can do from your garden, is just mulch. So when you're choosing a mulch, you want to really thinking about your garden and your soil as habitat. So if you are one of the creatures in that soil food web that we saw, it would be very difficult to hide within that powdered, it almost looks like coffee grounds in my lower left-hand side, almost just like a pile of sawdust. Where are you going to find shelter and hide out if you're a small creature in there? When you're choosing a mulch, really think about larger pieces. They last longer, and the larger particle size really provides that protection and habitat for the creatures that you're wanting to support in your soil. So how else can we conserve soil? I think these are some really great examples, a little bit larger scale here, more market garden size or farming size, but look at how beautifully mulched everything is. Do you see any uncovered soil there? It all either has a living root in it or it is covered with a carbonous mulch or organic matter. So as we've talked about kind of in summary, how do we conserve soil? How do we grow soil health and protect it? We leave the crop residue in the field. We leave those spent plants and those, picked tomato leaves or pansy, spent flowers. We leave that in the garden. Keep it on the soil. We prevent tillage. We don't stir. We don't mix. We add organic matter. And then we intercrop different plants. We allow different plants to be near each other, like that top slide there, where they have different root structures. And so not only they're supporting the soil in different ways, and they support different types of creatures because their roots are different. And then leave those residues on the surface. So just in summary about when we're looking at our soil, which is the most important asset that we have in our garden, is really to feed your soil at every season. So, think about 4 times a year. That is as a modest amount that can be helpful to think about. And again, consider the more diversity in the organic matter that you add, the more diversity in the nutrients that you'll get out of your food. And so they did a study on looking at the areas in the world where people had no heart disease, no tooth decay, and that people lived to be over 100. And they said, well, what do those areas, it's called the Blue Zones Project, and they said, well, what do those areas have in common? And what they found is that they were on the edge of a glacier melt. And so they found that the glaciers that had moved all around in that geographic area had brought with it some of that horizon, that top of the soil. And that as the glacier started melting, it was releasing all that diverse organic matter into the soil. And so what it meant is that the crops being grown in that soil had more nutrients. And so the people were healthier. Well, we can mimic that same dynamic in our gardens and in our farms by bringing diverse nutrients to our compost pile, to our gardens, layering it on top, and allowing the soil to eat. So if you only do one thing from this class, mulch. That's the single best thing that you can do for your garden, over and over again. It's not really a project or a task that's done, that if your soil is healthy, it will eat that mulch, and then you'll reapply. So consider that. So here's a little look at one of my gardens. You can see the chicken run behind it and some of the gardens in the front, you can see that there's no bare soil, that the soil is either full of plants or it's covered with wood chips or it's covered with another mulch. So it's densely planted so that there isn't areas of bare soil. Having my chickens right there means that I can feed them some of the spent crops, but then also bring that waste and carefully, once it's composted, not on lettuces or greens, but where appropriate, add that material back into the garden. And so you can see the corn in the side there, that we had a nice cabbage patch, tomatoes, zinnias, some currants in the foreground. So all those diverse type of root systems and plants, all providing not only diverse organic matter into the soil, but all different types and sizes of roots that are also creating habitat. We'll go through this with the assessment too, but I also want you to note that in this picture, see the picnic table in the center? Where to me, that's a critical part of regenerative gardening. So not only are we regenerating the relationships with the soil and the plants, we're bringing in the chickens to add to support and to help with insects and to eat, but we're also regenerating our relationship through the garden and to these creatures by having a destination place in the garden where you can go and sit and relax, and that the garden becomes part of your daily life. It becomes part of, we go out here and have coffee here. We have lunch here. We'll have a summer dinner here. And you can't help but pick a ripe tomato, or my children will pick a few lettuce leaves and add to the meal, or that it helps the garden be part of our lives instead of just a place of work and toil, that it's a place of joy and relaxation. And so that's kind of this intangible theme I want to weave through the class today, is how to regenerate our relationship with the garden and find joy. And to me, it's critical that you have a place to sit and rest and enjoy in your garden. Oop. One back. So as you saw in the picture there, and as we mentioned, another way to grow your soil and to protect it is to keep your soil full of roots. That's one way in farming we talk about this as a cover crop, and that means a crop that covers the soil. This can be done in a garden as well, and can be done with vegetables and with food. And you can see here the many, many benefits that it builds soil health and soil quality. It retains the soil and helps it stay in place and prevent erosion, or erosion is where the soil can move. We want to retain the soil and hold it in place. Planting cover crops or keeping the soil full of roots also suppresses weed growth. It means there isn't room for weeds to grow, and also supports the biodiversity. Again, it's this ecological approach of making sure that many of the different types of creatures have somewhere to go and have something to eat. So this can also look like a couple of just interchangeable words and that are deep in philosophy, but also are really easy to implement in our gardens. And that's this cover cropping or polyculture. So planting multiple types of plants in one area, or intercropping, meaning that we plant things together. And a classic and a traditional example of this is the three sisters, the corns, beans, and squash, which all support each other in different ways, and each crop supporting the other. But you can see here this soybeans being planted into the stubble in the field. Notice how much of the field is covered with mulch or organic matter. You don't see a big plowed field that's bare with just a row of starts. That we want to create these cover cropped or intercropped style plantings to again create habitat and diversity. I love the example with the crimson clover and the cereal grain there, where and we can do this with other crops in our gardens, but this is in the fall and winter. This can be a great way to help your garden thrive as the temperatures decrease. But also a way to maximize small spaces is to have those lower growing plants interplanted with the taller ones. So here's a couple of examples, of the differences between what some folks is kind of a European style gardening that was very much based in kind of the ideas of the monarchy and ideas of kind of the wealthy of having so much space that that we don't have to, squeeze the food together or plant densely. And so that's where this kind of on my left, on the screen on my left here, you can see the squash in the middle, huge areas in between the tomatoes and the squash. I do like seeing that there is mulch on the ground so that the soil is covered, which is positive. But again, when we just learned about this cover cropping and intercropping, where the roots actually form these dense areas for habitat where the creatures then hide and reside and eat, there isn't a lot of space in that left picture where the creatures could create habitat and thrive. Versus the picture on the right there, where you can see the beautiful eggplant and basil, lettuce and marigolds. Which one is more labor intensive over time? Is it the one if a weed blew in, germinated, and sprouted, which garden would you really see that in and notice that in? So on the right, the garden is densely planted so that it creates habitat for those microorganisms. Also, as we saw, that it suppresses weeds and creates that diversity of nutrients going into the soil so that the nutrients in the plants coming out are that much, or that it's that much more nutritious. So the garden on the right has less garden maintenance over time because it suppresses weed growth, there isn't as much room, and you'll have more health overall for your plants to thrive because of the microorganisms there. So these are just things to think about, that we want our gardens to be full of roots. We want them to be full of plants because that is what we see in nature. And that's what Fukuoka encouraged us, is he said, look at nature first to understand how to garden and farm. Nature does not plant things in a row with huge spaces between them. They plant in clusters and patchworks and intricate communities like prairies, forests. So that's what we want to mimic in our own gardens and farms for maximum health. Here are a couple other examples on different scales. On the left, you can see it's a raised bed, really beautiful with cabbages and nasturtium. It looks like there's carrots in there as well. And so really beautiful intercropping, very simple. So you've got, not only are you bringing in I love having flowers in my garden. And so you're bringing in the ornamentals and these edible nasturtiums, the edible flowers, with also crops that take a little bit longer, like your cabbages or kohlrabi or kales. And then on a larger scale, you can see this beautiful intercropping, almost mosaic of cabbages, and looks like there's chard and leeks and marigolds and spinach. And if grasses germinated in there or you had some weeds fly in, you would never even see them. So it also reduces the maintenance over time and maximizes that biological, ecological, relational benefit of having many plants in one place through roots, through leaves, through flowers. Lots of benefits to the diversity that we're seeing on the screen here. So here's another way to look at this is a schematic here. You can see the corn without cover crops. So similar to that garden where it was just corn, it was just the crop and nothing in between. And you can see where that carbon that's in the soil is exposed to oxygen, creating CO2, and your carbon leaves. We know now that CO2 is a harmful gas that we want to prevent. We want to keep the carbon in the soil, and that means keeping the soil covered. So we can see versus on the right, the corn with the cover crops. You can see where it's actually bringing more carbon in, because look at the root systems. Look in that brown area, the difference between the corn grown by itself, nothing else there, and the corn grown with cover crops. If you were a soil-born creature, if you were a creature that only lives in the soil, which space would you want to live in? Which space do you think that there's more food for the microorganisms and more habitat for them to live and thrive and eat and poop and make nutrients available for your plants? We can see how this extensive root system adds to water entering the soil and then keeps the nutrients in place. So this is what we're wanting to create, is similar to the corn with cover crops in our gardens and on our farms. So so we're kind of shifting from soils, but bringing in this kind of more metaphysical concept of regeneration, which is around shifting our mindset around gardens and landscapes. That for, part of the kind of mired history of, again, of the feudal systems, of slavery, of these different systems where people who had power had the land and then forced people to work in the fields. This kind of mentality still lingers in our gardens and on our farms, where often we start to talk about gardening or farming as a lot of work, as hard, as difficult, as toil. And so really starting to shift our thinking and the way we talk about it into this more therapeutic, healing, nutritive, sustaining, joyful, sanctuary type feeling. I'm really shifting into that my garden is my sanctuary, that my farm is my deepest joy is actualized when I'm on my farm, that I feel the most alive and connected when I'm in my garden. And so how we want to do this is important not only for us and our mindset, but also for future generations. For the young people coming up, if we're talking about, oh, this garden's a lot of work and my back, and oh, I need 12 hours to weed, and oh, this is so hard. Are we inviting the next generation to fall in love with gardening, to step into farming in a earth-based, plant-based lifestyle? No, we're saying like, dang, it's a lot of work. That sounds terrible. But if we're saying, come into my sanctuary, my space of joy that I love, come eat something or see something beautiful. We can do this through our language, but we also have to do it in our mindset. And so I have a few tips, because I see this a lot, is where I feel like gardeners kind of create their gardens in a way that like maximizes a lot of work and makes it feel difficult or like a burden or laborious. And so I want to offer some tips to you so that you can really start to shift not only your mindset, but also maybe make a few infrastructure or tangible shifts so that you fall in love with your garden again. And it's maybe a little easier. It's maybe more joyful because it's less labor. And so those tips of how to help lay out your garden, again, we'll talk about layout, like where you put your garden matters, or where you, how you access the garden. Making the garden inviting, having a destination. You can see the bench and table here and the little pathway that says, come check it out. Come into this space. Don't just look from afar. Come into this space. Be welcomed, be invited. Come and get nurtured here. And then that also means that you'll go to your garden more. How to make your garden your own, make it fun, and also really make it full of joy. So I'm going to shift into just a few tips around this. Gosh, this is so touchy. I'm so sorry that it keeps blinking. There. Okay, this seems really obvious, but for some reason it is a not guaranteed truth, is that when you are planning your garden, I don't know about you, but in the winter, I love to look at seed catalogs and circle things I might want to grow or feel excited about. And it sounds really obvious, but when you love to eat what you grow, you're going to take care of it more. And I think that sometimes we kind of get in this sense of like, well, maybe I guess I should have eggplant or I should have, beefsteak tomatoes. And then when it really comes down to it, actually, I don't really like beefsteaks, so I'm not going to grow them. And the more that I've honed in my garden to grow the things that I really love and that my family loves and my family eats, the more we go there and the more we participate and tend it. And then the more that we can bring that organic matter back to the soil. So like for me, I don't really like cherry tomatoes very much. I only like sun gold cherry tomatoes. And so I've just stopped growing cherry tomatoes. I think they're so annoying. I mean, I'm sorry, cherry tomatoes, not super annoying, but it's not my favorite. And so I've said, I'm going to grow way more Romas because that's what I use for canning and for soups and sandwiches. And so I've found that now that I'm wasting less food, I'm wasting less produce. And again, maybe some of you out there are like, this is so obvious, but I see it all the time where people are growing things that they don't necessarily like, and it means that they don't harvest it. And so then it again is in this kind of framework of feeling like labor and work instead of like cultivating the food you love. So just something to think about. Okay, let's see if I can keep this. There we go. Nope. The other tip is to really think about where your garden is and how you can access it. So maybe some of you already have gardens that are already established and you're like, I'm not moving my garden. But maybe if you're thinking about a new garden or you're supporting someone and thinking about a new garden or you yourself are new to creating a space, you really want to think about making that garden as accessible as possible. And again, this seems obvious when we say it out loud, but I see it all the time where people will put their gardens back behind a barn. That's actually what my neighbors did. They put their garden, you have to walk through their backyard, through a gate, past the backfield, through another gate that's always broken, and then in the back of the barn area where they put their garden, they can't even see it. And so they haven't tended it. They haven't cared for it because it's really far away from the house. And it's also beyond the hose, as I say, where the hose doesn't reach there. And they just doubled their work. And so of course their garden feels like a lot of work because the hose doesn't even reach it. Where if they could have made a smaller garden, I mean, I love my neighbors, they're very kind people, but it's a common mistake where if you could put your garden where you can easily reach it with your hose or however your routine goes, you're that much more likely to participate. So my fern garden, I have a fern fetish right now, and I have my fern collection is right off my back porch because they're the most water hungry. They want a lot of water, they want shade, and so the most water I'm going to give anybody is right off my back porch. So I rinse vegetables, I give that to my ferns. You know, we strain out the spaghetti, I let it cool in that water, I give it to my ferns. So they're thriving because that is so easy. It's 3 steps from my back door. So I'll water them a lot. If I had to go through the backyard, through the field to the back of the barn, I wouldn't water them. This is a picture on the screen here is someone who planted their garden down the hill or up the hill from their house. It's a slog every time you go there. It's going to be heavy both ways. And so then you just won't go there as much. The other piece I see is that often and this is kind of funny, but it is actually really true. The more gardens I've been to and visited where I do consultations or I help people in their garden or do plant ID, I often see that there is like a terrible gate in between where either the gate is heavy, it doesn't lift, it's partly broken, or there's like spiders or poison oak or dog poop or something where the actual access to the garden doesn't feel good. They're like, oh, that's just that old gate, get through it. And it's like, but it creates this mental barrier that becomes naturally really physical barrier. And if you can have a nice and tidy gate where you can, or deal with the spiders, or just, scoop that poop, that it will directly impact how often you go to your garden, how often you tend it, and how well your garden thrives. There's a direct connection. Here's this example, of these like terrible gates that lead to gardens that are just, I mean, we can all relate. It all takes maintenance and we understand. But it creates a barrier in our minds to seeing that as a sanctuary, to seeing it as a place that's joyful that you want to go. And then for your children or the young people or your grandkids or your neighbors who maybe you're wanting to include in gardening, they're like, oh, but it's always there's that scratching nail or there's that big spider, and it doesn't feel like a place they want to go. So this is like a call to action for us, right? In our generation, is to say, we need the young people to love gardening. Our earth needs the next generation to want to farm, to want to garden. Our very lives, our generations depend on that. And these are these little subtle ways that we can help literally open the door to them feeling like it's something appealing or of interest. The other piece is creating destinations in your garden so that people hang out there and stay there longer. So we got through, we went through, we found the garden, we're finally there, we got through the gate, whatever that looked like. And then in the garden itself, making sure that there are places where that you are drawing that person. Come sit over here and smell this, or eat this, or look at this. Come relax, come enjoy, come live life. And this can be such a fun way to like bring some personality to your garden. I love that little blue table. That's really, really, I have this slide as I really actually want that little teal blue table with this. And the sunshade. Can't you just see coming out there in an afternoon and having, iced tea out there, and you pick a little mint and maybe you weed for 5 minutes and make a bouquet. I mean, you want to go there. And so these are just those little simple investments that we can make, no matter how big or small, that just bring that feeling of love to the space so that then you want to be there more and then you'll love it more. Create spaces that you'll enjoy spending time in. This bench this is my front garden. This was years ago. It's a little bit more woolly now, but this is my front garden, and that bench was a gift for a holiday. My auntie and uncle made it for me. And so it also has a story and a feeling. And we spend so much time in this spot because it's one of the shadiest, nicest spots in the afternoon with that oak tree right there. And we have loved spending time here. If we didn't have a bench here, we would never come to this area of the garden. And so because we have this bench and because we spend time there, now we've planted, this becomes the spot where you can plant your most fragrant, beautiful plants, So we plant a fragrant jasmine there. We planted a mock orange behind there so that there's these fragrant plants that you'll smell and enjoy because you come and hang out there. So that's a way that, your plant palette and how you're using the space and how you are encouraging people to hang out and spend time there. Here's another, this is just a fun little tip about access and about, making things beautiful. So I showed you this garden before with the chickens, and I just kind of want to highlight this access piece. If any of you have chickens out there or they're, help you in your garden. We create this little portal. You can kind of see the fresh wood window in our chicken coop. And that was another way, again, about access, that we wanted to make it really easy that things from the garden could go to the chickens. And so we created this little portal window. We call it the portal, but it's a little window that you can open that has screen on it, and we can toss veggies or organic matter to our chickens, and then close it back up. And then also to make sure that that I'm doing my own work of creating this sanctuary feeling. We planted morning glories up the side of the chicken run there. And so you can see on the right the beautiful morning glories close up when they were blooming. But then each summer, each spring they germinate, and then the whole side becomes a wall of morning glories. And so not only does it offer the chickens shade during the summer, but it creates this beautiful wall and kind of, buffer from like the chicken scene for our picnic table where we love to have summer dinners. And so then we have this wall of morning glories that we're looking at within our garden with our picnic table there. And so these are simple solutions, right? We're not investing $10,000. We're investing in a $5 packet of morning glory seeds. But we're just thinking about how we can make this space beautiful. How can we bring life to the space that we'll enjoy? Again, I know these are obvious tips, but I just have to bring it up because, make sure that you can get water to your plants. And this is a really important lesson, but of course, it really directly impacts how well your garden will thrive. I and I bring this up because I used to house sit for some friends who had a larger garden, and they never had enough hoses to reach their garden. They were always like, "Oh, bring the hose that's 2 acres over there, drag it down the hill, around the corner, through a terrible gate with spiders, then just attach it on to this other hose, and then water the garden." Well, guess how much they did that? Not very much, because it was a huge pain in the neck. It was so unpleasant. And so for a gift, we bought them a new hose. We were like, you just need another hose. And that can be cost prohibitive for some who are on tight income, but you might just think about removing some barriers to watering. Making sure that watering is a joyful part of gardening, that it doesn't feel laborious, it doesn't feel like a slog or a horrible chore, that it actually, again, can reach easily. You have a nice head on there. Investing in a sprinkler is a really great idea, even just a sprinkler that goes on the end of your hose, and that those little battery timers, they work. I was really suspect of them for a while. I was like, I don't know. I don't really see how that works. I don't really get it. And I was unsure. And then I was like, we're going to do this. And we put those on to our sprinklers. And so that has made a world of difference for our garden. I also teach plant pathology and plant problem solving. And 80%, 80% of the time, well, if your plants are having a challenge, it's a water-based issue. So if you can make sure to water your garden adequately, already you're, avoiding so many common challenges. And you just cannot water adequately by hand. It just doesn't work. You would have to give every single plant a count of 30, and no one's doing that. We can do that with our containers or our potted plants, but in our garden, it is really worth the time and effort to buy a small metal sprinkler and a battery-powered timer, and that will exponentially improve your harvest, your crop, your garden's health. Will make a huge difference. So really not relying on watering by hand when possible, but making sure that your hose will stretch where your garden is where you're planting your garden or where you're investing in some more water hungry plants, making sure that you can actually water them, which does sound so obvious, but it's not when you're in the field. We all kind of make do, but then our plants suffer over time and we're like, oh, it didn't do very well. And then that affects our own morale of our garden. So also while we're talking about watering, it's so easy to include some ways to support the ecology. Again, that we're in regenerative gardening, we're regenerating, we're renewing these relationships, these ecological relationships between us and the creatures, but the creatures in themselves, the creatures in that physical space. And so creating these really simple watering stations that it has a saucer with no holes, a little bit of some pebbles and some larger stones And this is so that the bees can land and drink, that the butterflies can land and drink, but also the amphibians, the reptiles, all those creatures who we all need water will come and drink from these spots. What I've done is I've actually put them in places in my garden where the irrigation or the sprinklers that I set up automatically fill them so that they're filled through the irrigation and they're filled so that I want the ecology, all the creatures in my garden to access water. And so it's important that we put these little watering stations for our pollinators and the amphibians and reptiles too, who we want in our gardens. So as I mentioned, my fern garden, I had to put a picture of this because it just looks so good right now, or I did a while back. So I had to include my fern garden in this. But again, just that example of putting your thirsty plants, some of us, we know we need to plant drought tolerant and we believe in it and we do, but then, gosh, some of these thirstier plants that we just, fall in love with, just making sure that you plant them in a place where they will get more water. And that is, I find, often near the door that's closest to your kitchen. Because when you're washing vegetables, when you're rinsing something, when you're washing hands, washing potatoes, whatever you do to wash or rinse, that then you can just take that water right out to that kind of water loving garden and pour it and have that supplemental water really just kind of in the flow of your life. And so this is my back porch fern garden, as I call it, which is one of my most beloved gardens. And it's thriving partly because it has a sprinkler and also because it gets the supplemental water from my kitchen, as we're doing daily life. The other tip I have for you today is to really think and consider using cotton sheets instead of landscape fabric. One of the ways that I work with preventing weeds and keeping weeds out of my garden or out of my paths is by, the cotton sheets that maybe got messed up in the laundry or have a hole and then maybe got used on the floor or got used as a drop cloth. And then you're like, now what do I do with these cotton sheets? Well, I cut them to size and I put landscape pins in the side so that it sits down really tidy. And then I put my mulch on top. Just like people use plastic landscape fabric, I use cotton sheets. I've really doubled down and decided that I'm not buying new plastic whenever possible. That my generation, we've seen the garbage in the ocean and the plastic in the ocean, and I'm personally saying I'm just not buying new plastic anymore when possible. And so for me, as a regenerative organic gardener, I'm not going to buy plastic to lay down in my garden either. And so instead, I've been using cotton sheets or even cotton towels as that barrier. And then I put mulch on top so you don't see the sheets, you don't see the towels because they're covered in mulch. And this has been a way that I make the mulch last longer on my paths and also prevent weeds in certain small areas. But I think that this has been so successful in our garden that I really encourage everyone to try it out and to really consider whether buying new woven plastic is in alignment with your values as a regenerative gardener. And so instead to really think about how can we use cotton instead, because it lasts quite a while. I'd say that the cotton sheets for my paths last around 2 years. And then we often do another layer. So it has good longevity, but it just is not buying more plastic that's going to the landfill. And then I love this example of the fitted sheet where pulling the fitted sheet over your raised bed, both to either protect if you're trying to germinate something, protect from frost, but then also, you could kind of act as a smother to keep things out. So there's a lot of great uses here to consider. So part of what the research that I've been doing this is a picture of our farm on Hartley Road here right outside Talent, is what's called occultation tarping. And so it's using a tarp, a vinyl tarp any kind of tarp you can use, and to occult means to make dark. So you're making the soil dark, you're making the area dark so that because the soil food web, all those creepy crawlers only eat and become active in the dark. If it's light out or sunny, they go down and hide from the sun. So when you occult something, you make it dark, you pull that tarp over the soil or the grass, as you can see in the picture. It acts as a smother, so the plants don't receive any sunlight, and it encourages the soil food web to start to eat in that dark space under the tarps. So you can leave those tarps for about 4 to 6 weeks and then remove them. It is not plastic mulch. It's not the plastic mulch where farmers are leaving on the beds all year. That is not what this is. This is a temporary use that then is removed. And what is under those tarps is organic matter. It's mulch, and the plants are dead, and you can actually plant right into it. And so we can mimic this same style in our raised beds, in our containers, where we just, we can use a smother, we make it dark, we help everything eat, and then we pull it off and we plant right into it. So this is not just another strategy for, ways that we can implement or apply the values that we've talked about of protecting the soil, of keeping those layers intact, of feeding the soil food web, providing organic matter. All of those practices can be implemented through occultation tarping. And this is a regenerative technique. And this is part of what Verdant Phoenix Farm, that we're engaged in this soil research to really bring this this technique or this strategy forward to help share about it. So you can see there the before and after. This is a grassy field. You can see the other tarps that are still in place, and right in the foreground, the area where a tarp had been laid and then removed, and you can see that the grass is dead, but that the organic matter is intact, so that the grass is dead, but it kind of comes with its own mulch, that there's its nice dry carbonous mulch covering the soil. And then we just rake the carbonous mulch to one side and we plant right into it. No rototilling, no stirring, no tractors. We're just using the biological action of the soil to prepare that planting area and then planting into it. Here's a little closer look at that after effect. So you can see, again, that mulch. But here's the closer look of what's there. It looks like a worm bed underneath, because that's what's been happening, is those worms and all the creatures are coming up. They're eating, they're breaking things down, and then they're protected with that organic matter still on the soil surface, that mulch still protecting the soil there. So as we mentioned before, especially this time of year, do not clean up the garden. We want the leaves on the soil. We want to leave the roots for the critters. We want to keep adding that organic matter back and to keep creating that pore space through the roots. Especially right now with the leaves on the ground, I like to rake the leaves off the paths and put them back into the garden. So that's part of how I manage my leaves. I do have some grassy areas where I like to have grass. And so I pull the leaves off of that and put the leaves back into my perennial gardens, or to like the fern garden that I showed you earlier. And so again, we're wanting to keep organic matter there for habitat, for the roots, and for the microbes to thrive. So the other tip is that we're really learning how powerful it is when plants fight their own fights. That when you maybe have a little bit of a brassica with a little bit of aphids on it, or you might see, I don't know about you, but my milkweed every year gets aphids. And I'm always like, oh, what's the deal? They're totally healthy, things next to it, no aphids. But it actually is feeding all of the creatures who are who eat insects and who eat aphids, but they're also a direct connection with those plants that have had to kind of fight or defend themselves or protect themselves, actually have more nutrition in them. And so sometimes I feel like we can be quick to use a product or quick to kind of correct instead of letting the ecology balance itself out. But what we're finding is that when plants, what research has showed is that plants actually, when they have had to fight their own fight from an insect, that they actually have more nutrition because of it. So here's a few other ways. Let me just make sure I didn't. Yeah, okay. Here's a few other ways to bring joy to your garden. And this is always a fun, just thing to think about and talk about. It can be a way, to think of supporting, again, the people in your life who are interested in gardening, or bringing some passion and love to your garden, through bringing in a bird bath, again, that ecological, when we're looking at those ecological relationships, thinking, well, what do the amphibians need? What do the birds need? Having a wind chime to create, that feeling, create a feeling in the air. I love this really simple little teepee trellis here. I mean, how simple and sweet, but it provides an opportunity for beans and cucumbers and squash. Just a little feature that can be so simple. All the way to, wow, look at these lights in this amazing raised bed garden. Just those little bit of light in the garden creates such a festive and fun feeling, and really make it a space that you want to go. And then all the way to this kind of quirky, gazebo or painted wall in the garden. Mary Foster, who's in the Master Gardeners for years, I went and saw her garden one time, and she had this amazing little part of her fence that she painted bright blue in her garden. And it looked so amazing. It became this canvas for everything else that was in front of it. And it always inspired me of like, wow, that blue fence, Mary Foster's, so beautiful, and can be just simple. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be simple, but just something that brings you joy, to make sure that that joy is in your garden. So we're kind of narrowing in on our time. So we want to kind of synthesize some of this with a little garden assessment. So our criteria is that we want to look, I'm going to be asking you, and I wish we could be more participatory, but I want you to think about these things. The criteria is we want to assess these gardens that I'm going to show you for soil health. Is the soil covered? Are they taking care of their soil? Are they feeding it? Do they have good access to their garden? Are they cultivating the ecology in their garden and the whole ecosystem there? And is it joyful? Does it seem like a place you'd want to go? So that's our rubric, our criteria. And so now we're gonna assess these next gardens that I want to show you. So here's my garden again, the chickens. When we look at the soil health, do we see bare soil? Do we see mulch in place? How's the access? Are we able to get there easily? Can we use the things that we want to use there? Is there a place for us to find joy and relax? So we kind of looked at this one. So that's to kind of attune your eye. So now let's look at another one. What about this garden? So at first it's like, wow, they've got a lot growing there. But what do you notice about their soil? How does their soil health look? Do we see bare soil? Do we see uncovered soil? Do we see any mulch or organic matter? Is there anywhere you can go to sit or get out of the sun? Like you can tell when you're going to this garden, you are working, and that is it. There's nowhere to sit, nowhere to hang out. What about this garden? Do you see any bare soil? Do you see any weeds? Couldn't find a single weed if you wanted to, really. I mean, it's full. Is there a place to sit? Is there a place to go? Can you see the trellis? It's kind of hard to see the trellis, but it creates a cool portal, and then there's that neat kind of bench thing. I want to go see what's over there. It draws you in. great diversity here. Whoops. How about this garden? See some diversity. How's the soil look here? We see some kind of rock mulch around. We see some diversity, and I love it that it has the tiny little patio kind of connected with the table where you can sit and hang out. I definitely want to have coffee here. Looks like you would get kind of hot, be kind of scorching. Cute little fence, and I love that they utilize the garden beds near the fence, so for some vertical space and different size gardens, I think is really interesting. How about this one? Also a lot going on here, some really great infrastructure here. But could you go and have your coffee in this garden? Could you go and have a picnic or dinner here? I like the use of vertical space. I like the different size raised beds, but you can see a lot of bare soil. And just thinking about, bringing a little bit more flair or joy into it, making sure you can hang out there, spend time there, and that there's a destination. But beautiful garden. I mean, nice urban, large scale garden. What about this one? Where, a nice little bench. It's got some windsocks. You can see a mixture of tomatoes and sunflowers and cosmos there. So you can see that there's some diversity, some mulch on the ground there. It's just so inviting. You can see the birdhouse. It feels like a place you'd want to go. So it's kind of fun. I mean, no garden is wrong, and they're not like better than the other. But it's just things to think about in this time of life when we're looking at our gardens and thinking about like, well, what should I do next? Or when people are like, well, can I help you in your garden? Or maybe your spouse or your housemate or your grandchild is like, hey, you want to bring them out to the garden. And they're like, well, what do I do? And this can be a way to start to think about, well, what to do next? Again, so what I'm encouraging you and what the research has shown, this is science-based, research based content is, again, to protect your soil and to mulch it. That's the simplest, best thing you can do for your garden and your plants. To buy more hose. I think a hose makes a great Christmas present or a Hanukkah present or a New Year's present or birthday present. Buy your gardener friends a new hose. Create some watering stations for to really think about the ecology, thinking about the other creatures that you want to be in your garden, and making the garden somewhere you want to be in your garden. Have those spots to sit and linger, have those spots to spend time. But to really shift our minds to think ecologically about habitat, both in the soil and in the garden, in these spaces. We know now with urban growth that habitat is more important than ever. And even small patches of habitat can be an oasis for a lot of life. So even if you just have a small garden, it can still really matter to the creatures who live near you. And it matters to you. So to really assess your garden for maximum enjoyment, to really go out and be like, this gate has always bothered me, and that spider, spider, you got to kind of move down a few rungs. Or, if I own, wow, $25 a stepping stone, excuse me, having a few stepping stones can make a huge difference in your garden. So it's really about re-energizing ourselves so that we can regenerate our garden. We can reform these relationships, and then we can model to future generations about how gardening and farming is a practice of joy. It's a practice of sanctuary and nurturing, that it's not a lot of hard work. It's not, oh, so much breaking my back, that it's actually, we're inviting them to a practice that is earth-based and special and that feeds us over time. So I wanted to share my contact information there, again, with Verdant Phoenix Farm. I also do nonprofit consulting through Growing Assets for Nonprofit Excellence. And so we do grant writing and fundraising, board retreats and staff retreats, instead of some of my professional work, but also there at Verdant Phoenix Farm. We offer garden consultations and plant ID and just garden support because we know that one of the solutions to the modern challenges is to get outside and get in our gardens. And so the more that we regenerate and invest in our relationship with our own garden, the healthier we are, the healthier the planet is, and the healthier the next generations are. So thank you for doing your part to love your garden and to be there and through being connected in this way. And it has been really special to have you here.